interactives and what exactly are interactives, and then even some of the things that we have to think about as we get into them. I think a lot of times we're used to interactives being just digital stuff. That's what we work with. But there's also low tech, there's no tech, things that we can go in and work with. So the key points we're going to look at today is we're going to look at interactive media. What exactly is interactive media? What are the types of it? We're going to go and we're going to look at the user experience or the visitor experience. We're going to talk about technologies. What technology is available to us? What kind of interactives are we talking about? What makes a successful interactive? Getting into writing an interactive brief. So when we talk about design briefs, we're going to talk about an interactive brief. What goes into writing that interactive brief? And then lastly, any other considerations that go into interactives. So what exactly is interactive media? It's anything that we ultimately go in and interact with. The big thing to know about interactive media, though, is that it used to be a novelty. It used to be you'd show up somewhere and you'd be like, oh, wow, look, there's something here to interact with. It's no longer that way. We go to an exhibition, we go someplace, we are expecting to have something to interact with. So we go through, we start to think about all the different learning methods that we work through. Interactives make a major part of that. So we go through, what we're looking at is we're trying to come up with some way to offer our audience something that is unique, that is highly memorable, and essentially the goal there is to get them to think about that, to continue to think about what's going on inside of the rest of the exhibition. If you've gone to any Center of Science and Industry, COSI, Imagination Station, what it's called now, but any of those places you go into, the kids want to interact with something. So think about what things can we go in there, can we bring in there. The interactive element needs to feel as though it's integrated. So it's not just something that you add on. Early on when we started dealing with interactives, they were add-on things. Oh, we're doing this show. Oh, wait, let's just go ahead and let's put this over here in the corner. And when the kids come in or the adults come in, or whoever your audience is, when they come in, they'll eventually get over to this spot. But you can see it wasn't actually integrated into the rest of it. So it should feel integrated. Think about all the different ways in which we can actually go in and interact with our audience. The other key part of working with the interactive is that it needs to be rooted into what the overall narrative is. So why are people there? What is your purpose of having this exhibition? What is the purpose of the stuff that you've chosen to be inside of the exhibition space? And then how does that interactive work itself back into the rest of the exhibition? And then since we are working with something, we're doing something, we're learning something, there is a purpose for it. So since we are learning, there should be learning actual objectives or learning outcomes that we get from that. So the objective of doing this is this. This is that desired learning outcome. The audience is going to learn this part, identify this, recognize this. So as we go through and we start to think about what's there, what is that outcome that's going to come from this? They aren't usually super complex. We're not talking about 6 or 7 different outcomes usually. Usually what we're going towards, there's 1 or 2 desired learning outcomes that you have based upon the interactive element that you've added into that exhibition space. So we go and we start to look at what's happening with it. So with this here, this is part of the Google Web Lab. It's in the Science Museum there. So with this, they're able to actually interact with stuff. So we have different people in different spaces able to go in and work with different elements. So as we start to look at that, we'll get into the part where we start thinking about interactives as to whether or not we're talking about things that are a single person, so single user, or multiple user. And advantages and disadvantages to both sides. And that's the challenge we have when we start going into spaces too, is to think about what is it that we want to have people coming in and interacting with and how much is going to be there. Now as they enter in, we're always talking about the visitor. Demographic is key. But also with that visitor, what is the experience? So as the visitor comes in, what's the visitor experience overall? Well, anytime we go through and we start thinking about things that are interactive, what's the key goal of interaction? It's fun. We want to get away from the fact of just sitting here having someone go, back in 1941. No, nobody wants to hear that stuff. No, not nobody, but most people aren't going to sit there. They don't want to hear that things being recited to you. What they want to do, they want to interact with stuff. You can start looking at things from, even from a timeline standpoint. You know, grab a hold of a slider, you move it across, and you go to a certain year, and things pop up on the screen to tell you what's going on that year. So first and foremost, when we go through and start to work with it, is our goal is to actually go in and engage our audience. We're going to engage them through the emotion side of it. It's like, oh, this is so exciting, I want to go do that. So that's what we're trying to get them to do, is we're trying to get them excited about it, emotional response to it, so that they go in and become part of it. And then once they get into it, that's when we actually want to go in and begin to show them how to do something, or to teach them some sort of skill or facts or anything like that. So we have to get them in. We have to reach out, make that emotional plea to them. Secondly, then we need to go and we need to actually think about what it is that we're doing in there. How are they actually going to navigate it? It should be easy to navigate it. It should be logical. So they shouldn't have to go in and we're not going in and dealing with some sort of like lockbox where they have to get really fancy to get into the stuff. When they move from one space to the next, it's not like trying to get out of an escape room or anything like that. We want to make sure that it's logical. And really we go through and start looking at it is that any way that they're going to go in and begin to think about or working to navigate that, if they can't do it in 30 seconds or less, they're probably going to walk away. So look at that, think about that. How intuitive is it with everything that we're ultimately going in and working with? Now, as I talked about, are we dealing with single player or multiplayer? So when we go through and we start to think about working with single player or multiplayer, the advantages to single player are you only need one person to do it. The advantages to multiplayer is more people can actually take part at the same time. However, what could be one of the downfalls of multiplayer? What happens if if it's a multiplayer and I have to have 2 people, or I have to have 3 people, or I have to have 4 people for it to work?
Yeah, sometimes you don't have that many people.
Right, so if we get into a spot where you have the exhibition, and there's a time that there's a lull in the people that are showing up, maybe it's during the day, and all of a sudden you have one person who's like, I'm going to go in here, and they walk in, and they're looking at it, but it's a multiplayer, and they need multiple people to do it. They can't actually take part in it. So as we start looking at multiplayer, there's a couple different parts of that. It's multiplayer needing multiple people for it to function. There's multiplayer, which means that multiple people can do something at the same time, but it isn't necessary to have all of them. So as you start to think about what's going into that for that interactive, be aware that sometimes we go and we create it. If we want multiple people to be involved to play it, well, you have to then also make sure that you have enough people that are there. Now with the continuing advent in the way that AI is working, it's entirely possible that you can go in there and you can have a computer actually take part in another piece of it. So as you start to think about it, look at their advantages, disadvantages, what can you do with that? How can you create something that can have a multiplayer effect to it? Maybe I know I've gone into stuff and I need multiple things to happen, and I'll start one and I'll move to another one, I'll start that, move to another, and start that. So even something like that to where you can still see choosing different routes and what's going to end up ultimately happening with it. And then the last thing is just something to really take your mind off of the fact that when we go through and do it, that maybe the user isn't always the person in control. So when we go through and start to think about that, as you sit there and you start to watch stuff, maybe you're actually there taking part in it. You are also a user, and you're reacting to what's actually taking place. However, you're not actually physically in control of it. So if we go through it, you start thinking like multiplayer, and all of a sudden you have somebody doing something, and there's something moving, and that one person's controlling it, and the other person isn't. Well, you're still interacting with it. You're still a user, but you have no control over what is actually going on.
Like being on a roller coaster.
Like you're part of it. It's an interactive experience. You don't control anything that's going on. So what exactly can you go through and do with that? So we go through and we start to look at this. So now what we have here is, this is a current image is in the background. And what they end up having is the ability to overlay images. So if we start thinking about working with smartphones and the fact that we can put an image up, and we start thinking about like augmented reality. Well, what we can do with that is, if somebody's going through a space, it is entirely possible. There's a marker on the ground, you sit there, you stand on it, and you hold your phone up. You can hold it up on this space and you can see what was going on in there. So buildings are collapsing, you can hold those things up. You kind of think about the standpoint, you go back, let's talk about 9/11, 21 years ago almost, crazy. But you go through and you set that up. I mean, it's entirely possible to be able to hold something up from a location and have the skyline and be able to see videos going over top of stuff and stuff going down and see where it would actually end up with the current way that a building looks. So we go through and start to think about what are additional technologies that are out there. You may be limited as to what technologies you know that exist, but what I urge you to do is to don't limit yourself into just what you know about, but go ahead and do some more research on what technologies are available. Now what's really nice as we get in and start thinking about interactives is that interactives have the capability from a technological standpoint to be high tech, low tech, or no tech. So when we start talking about no tech, think about like slide puzzles. That's no tech. As we start thinking about tracing your way through an area and there's a little peg in there that you can slide around, again, that's no tech. Now can we get to the really ultra high tech? Yeah, we certainly could, where we're dealing with maybe an augmented reality setup, maybe we're looking at a virtual reality environment as well. That can become part of the interactive. All of those things are capable of being used. Of course, we'll talk about it again when we get to the budget side of it, but what exactly can you afford with it? So as we start to think about what other things do we have available to us? So what are we using for our electronic or digital interactions? Well, the key things that all of us work with are our smartphones. Another thing that we also have are tablets. So we start thinking about that. Tablets, most places now when you go in, you're working with anything that's kiosk-based, and I always call it kiosk-based when there's something sitting in front of you with the device in there. Those are iPads that are just plugged in and wireless, and you sit there and click and you can go through it. Another thing we can start to look at are projections. Projections give us the capabilities of working on something very large scale, but with that large scale, there's a lower cost. I can take a projector and I can project a 10-foot wide image with a simple projector. A couple $100 versus going and making that entire wall become a video wall for $25,000, $30,000. So as we start to think about that, what is it that we have available to us? What is it that we can use from a technology standpoint? That's where we have to go in and start to think about what's out there. Expose ourselves to what is out there. Now there are lower cost setups. So low cost interactive portal, like I said, we put a $400 iPad on there. It's going to work. If you have somebody going and working with their smartphone, that can work. Touch screens. You can have a touch screen monitor running to an older computer possibly. That'll work. So what do you have available to you to go in and work when we start dealing with the technology? And this is the X calling me. I'll call her back later. Also, we start seeing things where we use social media experiences. So how do we tie things in to social media? What is it that we can do with the social media? The great thing about being connected is that we can go in and do a lot of different stuff with it. But what can we do with those links? What can we feed? The other thing we can also do when we start getting into social media is the ability to have live feeds. Imagine we go there and start talking about experiences and we have a projector up there. And now anybody who goes in there and puts that hashtag in, sends a message, all of a sudden it just keeps going up there and populates. Now, Usually, you want to make sure that someone's either following along with it, or of course, there's a warning that you don't know what's going to go up there because anything can show up on there. But there are ways we can do that. What is it we can add in there? People adding images in there and stuff. We talked a little bit earlier in the semester dealing with sound. Sound ultimately becomes a key component. But we have to think about how are we going to go in and deal with the sound. Are we dealing with headphones? Are we trying to go in to start to deal with localized sound? The other thing we have to be careful of when we start dealing with sound is that we don't want sound to bleed into other areas. Technology, what's the other thing? Well, it's really difficult for us to future-proof. Technology's rapidly changing. So as the technology goes through and changes and works, what ends up happening with that is that there's nothing that we can do for that. We just have to think about what's going to go on as this comes out. Is something going to come out and then break something? In essence, not allowed to go through and function. The other thing we start to get into are future-proofing and ways that we interact with things. So if we go through and we start looking at how are we listening to things, what are we stuck with headphones-wise? Think about devices that all of a sudden lose a headphone jack. People would have really thought that a headphone jack would disappear. So things like that start to come into play. So think about what's going to happen with that from a technology standpoint. If this is planning to have a big long run, how much may that technology change over that period of time? And when we go through and start looking at technology, you can have an ultra high tech and it can fail. You can have an ultra low tech or no tech and it be super successful, because really success is just going to be measured by the usefulness of it. If we can't use something, then we have a problem with it. People aren't going to use it, they're not going to experience it, it's a waste of money. So as we go through and we start to think about what technology we're using, keep all of that stuff in mind. Now, is it going to drive the end decision? Really, that's going to be dependent upon situation by situation. So when we go through, we start looking at technology. So what this is here is, it's allowing us to go through and look at different people's paths as they go on their journey to work across London. So we start looking at what's going to happen with it. And these are all sketch ideas going in to start to break down what exactly is this interactive going to be. So we look up there, we see our mainline transport actually coming into Paddington Station. Once it gets into there, these are other main connections that are made from the station across London. We have additional connections here. To move down there, there's a single person's journey across London to work. Then we have 2 people going, we have 4 passengers going, and then lastly we see where 64 different passengers end up going. So we can start to look at what's going to happen with this, how is it going to go in there and play. Now what's fun with this is we could go in with this, and this could simply be loaded in with data based upon 64 people, and you can choose the people. Characters 1 through 64 are all listed. Well, I wonder how Janie B got to work compared to Jimmy G. And you hit them, and all of a sudden you can watch the thing start to move. You can go through and you can start to play from a time-based standpoint of what time did they start, what time did they end. And the other thing we can go through and start to think about then is, can people add to them? Like you can go in there and say, oh, I want to add mine in there. So here we go. And this is when I started, this is where I went, this is the route I took. Okay, boom, now it's in the database. Now people can pick you off on the list. You can have it randomly just pull 4 people. How do these 4 people get to work? And boom, it pops up 4 names, different colors, and we watch them go. So as we start to think about what is it that we can do with it, think about what are you going to do with it? Is there any way to build in a little bit of randomization to it? So that way if I go up to it and I see it today, it does one thing, and if I come back with another group of people next week and I do it, all of a sudden it gives me something else. That's because as we go in and we start to work with things, if you already know what's going to happen, you're probably not going to interact with it. So at that point, you'll just look at it, say something, or maybe you'll go up and you'll work with it. So we start to look at that. What do we have available to us? And then this here is the large version that then is working. So this goes through and you can see time up there at the top, allowing us to see exactly what's going on with it. And then we have the different paths that will illuminate down below. So we go in and we decide, of course, like I said, people expect that there's going to be an interactive in there. It's no longer that novelty thing. So when we go through and we start to work with it, we need to figure out then what kind of interactive do we need? Or what kind of interactive are we going to have? So they really fall into many categories, but really what we're going to go in and start to look at are going to be those that are find out more interactives, our gaming interactives, and our environmental interactives. So what exactly are these? Well, if we go and we look at our find more interactives, these are actually layered. They're often single user interactives, and these are actually encouraging you to dig deeper into what is there. So you're exposed to something, you know that it's there, then you go in there and you start digging into those. What's really nice about going in and looking at the find out more interactives is that they're great for any level. If you're interested in the subject, you're going to get in there. Well, if you get into aircraft and you get into a certain airplane, and then all of a sudden with that you can look at certain ones that maybe ran certain key battles. Inside those key battles you can find out what the role was of that plane. So you can see how you can continue to dig deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into it. Or you can just go, I wonder what planes were in that battle. And you can see the planes, and that can be the end of it. So what's great about it is it does allow you to have a larger audience, but it also then allows the user themselves to decide just how far they're going to dig into there to get it. Most of the times when we see these are all permanent installations. You can see because of the fact that they're find out more, so we can keep digging and digging and digging. Another thing we'll also find with find out more interactives is a lot of times you'll find these connected then also to like the internet, into databases, research-based stuff. So the amount of information that's available, while it is finite, it's really close to getting to that infinite setup as to how far we can keep going. Kind of like a rabbit hole, you can continue to keep working your way down through it. And you can also find out more interactives, which will dig into like an app. So maybe it's on your phone, you can download the app to your phone and then go ahead in there and continue to interact with that. The second one are gaming interactives. Now with this, what ends up happening with this is there are key principles to this. Typically it is non-linear. And I say that because if you're playing a game where you roll and you move certain spots, maybe you choose a couple things, it can become linear, but typically they are going to be non-linear. So we're talking about gaming interactives, we're talking about you moving amongst an environment inside of a system. And with that, you're choosing where you're going, at what time, and what's going to end up happening with it. Usually when we go through and do these are all for our kinesthetic learners, people that actually learn by doing. That's exactly who I am. You can go in there and you can put something up and tell me something over and over and over again. And yeah, I'm going to hear it over and over again, but I'm not actually going to commit a whole lot of it to memory. I learn by doing. We go through and we start looking at learning. Remember, we learn by listening. With that, there's a small percentage of people that go, it's like 20-25% of people will be able to recite stuff by learning. We go through and we look at just doing. Usually by just doing, we can increase that to 50 to 60%. But when we learn by hearing and doing, it creates up in that 80% range of people that can actually return what it is that's there. So we go through and start looking at it. Think about what's going to happen with that and what are you going to do. So are they reading something and doing something? Are somebody talking to them and doing something? So how are they going to go about learning inside of that? But the key on there when we start looking at gaming interactives is that they are doing something. So they're physically doing something with that. Now they don't need to be digital. When we start talking about that, yes, we're talking about gaming. They do not need to be digital though. They can be simply mechanical. One example I have on there is we start talking about a seesaw. I can set up a seesaw, teeter-totter, whatever you want to refer to them as, and we can go in there and we can begin to talk about what's going to happen as we start getting into leverage and with balance. So as we start putting stuff on there, what's going to happen to it? As we weigh things out, what's going to happen to it? If I move the point, that we have the lever starting from our pivot point, if I move it different directions, what does that do to it? So that there is dealing with an actual mechanical device that is a gaming interactive trying to figure something out, but is not digital. So what else can we do with it from a gaming standpoint? Now the key thing here is that we're looking at key principles. And they're going to, based upon the gaming interactives, are going to have you take any key principles that were presented to you and then take those and demonstrate those inside of that interactive piece. If you go through and do something that doesn't work, you can of course go back and listen to it again or watch something again that will help indicate what it is that you need to do, and you need to go in and do that. Now the challenge as we get into our gaming interactives is that along with your gaming interactives, there's going to be pitfalls there. Things that are not going to work. What are the pitfalls of that interactive? You need to think about those, you need to identify those. Now you can't always completely fix them. But what you need to do is figure out what can you do to actually go through and attempt to mitigate them though. So we're not going to have, it's still possible that it can happen, but we're going to reduce the likelihood of that occurring. So it's kind of like if you think about a game and we're dealing with digital, you play, and you go in areas and you make selections that you wouldn't normally make. It's kind of like what happens if you go through and there's a quiz portion for you to move on. If you always answer the right answer and you move on, well, what happens if somebody answers the wrong answer? All of a sudden you realize that the answer is C. If you answer C, yeah, you move on. But all of a sudden you realize if you answer A, oh, yep, you die. You answer B, yep, you die. But if you happen to click on D, for some reason it allows you to continue even though it's the wrong answer. So you're kind of going and you're debugging it. The same thing is going to happen when we're dealing with these, even if they're mechanical. What happens if we move? Is it possible that something isn't in the right location, but it's still able to function? Yes, what can we do to mitigate that? Then we get into environmental interactives. Now with these are designed to be immersive. So with that, when we're talking about immersive, we're talking about you're going to be a part of it. So they tend to be really, really large scale. Now the goal here with them is to get us into those. So we're looking at an emotional response. They're also usually very powerful and have a really overarching message to them. That's because you're in it. You can start to show things from a scale standpoint. You know, imagine if you're into this interactive and it's dealing with projections and you're at an aquarium and while you're standing towards the wall, all of a sudden the projections have different animals that'll come by. So all of a sudden you have a little tiny fish come by. You're like, oh, that's easy. You flick it with your finger and you can make it disappear. And then all of a sudden we move in and here comes a larger fish. And then we have a sturgeon come through. And then we have a whale come through. What's the difference between this giant whale versus something like a great white shark? So what are these things that we can have in there? The goal really is to push that though. What is the connection to it? But they can have a really powerful meaning because I no longer have to get a beluga whale into this room for you to see it. I instead can put it on a projector and all of a sudden you can see that thing go by and realize just what there is from a scale standpoint. They actually tend to be more like an art interactive or an art installation piece, I should say, than an interactive. So when we go through and we start to work with that, what's there? Well, it's designed, again, we're looking at projections, maybe we're projecting stuff on fabric. We have things inside of a tube that are designed for lights going inside of there that we can walk around. But the key here though is we want to go in and we're dealing with some sort of sensory impression to it. We're not necessarily talking about learning. Yes, are you going to learn something? Certainly. You're going to realize, that this little tiny fish that comes across there is nothing compared to a giant whale. But our goal with this is to get you in there. It's that experience. It's the sensory part of it. Yes, we're going to learn. You're going to learn with anything that you go through and you do. The other thing that's nice too is they actually can carry a wide range of content. So we start getting into the environmental stuff. I mean, it's really kind of limitless as to what you can do from a content standpoint. So what's going to happen is it's also going to take advantage of a larger part of the story. So we can go through and we can start to talk about all the things that are there. What's the timing for it? Well, we're dealing with projections. They can have one come across, we can let you know something else is coming across, and then something else is coming across. Or what would it be like if all of a sudden they all start just kind of swimming in there and you can see yourself on that wall? I mean, if you stand there with your back to the projector, you're going to project a silhouette onto the wall, so as those things go by, you can see exactly what it is from a scale standpoint. So in that situation, maybe it's just a spectacle. You're just seeing what is taking place. There are other things, though, where you can interact with it. Now, what happens if we go through and we start to deal with them swimming, and you can put your hand up and move your hand, it gets in front of the projector, and once you put it in front of the projector, then all of a sudden it goes through and the things swim out of the way. So we can go through, we can look at those types of interactions. The best part about environmentals, though, is we can keep them up to date live with feeds. Push new things to them. We push a new image to it, new video to it, the projector, and boom, all of a sudden it goes through and begins to change. So what makes a successful interactive? Now the key things we go in, we start dealing with successful interactions. It must be interesting. It must be easy. So it's easy for the user to go through and do stuff with it. And it must be fun. When I go back to that, remember we talk about it being fun. If people enjoy interacting with something, they're going to continue to interact with it. When my kids were, we went to the Air and Space Museum, and there's a little thing in there where you're actually shooting at stuff. They got in there and they had fun with that. They played it. It became a battle as to who could kill more things, shoot more things down, and stuff like that. So it should be fun. It needs to be approachable. So when we start looking at what's there, it shouldn't be intimidating for the person going up there to use it, because otherwise they're not going to go up and interact with it. Once you get up to it, it should be really easy for you to go through and ultimately discover what's required. How do you navigate? Remember that 30 seconds that's there. So when I go up to, okay, it wants me to do this. Okay, here's how I control it. Okay, perfect, let's go. If it takes any longer than that, we're probably not going to work with it. What are the clear goals? Not only what are the clear goals, but what do I have to do to achieve those clear goals? Another thing to start looking for is get the feedback and encouragement during the interactive experience. As a user and as a designer, you want that feedback and encouragement. So as we start to work with it, you go and you click on it, it's like, oh, that's not the door you want, but you're really, really close. Yep, that's the door you want. Keep going. Okay, they're coming. Move faster. Running. You're doing a good job. Keep running. So anything that we can also go in there and start to do to trigger to encourage them to keep working with it. The other thing as we start to work with the interactives, especially inside of a space, is keeping some consistency with it. So as we start to work with whatever we use for our interface or our controls, keep them consistent. There's a reason why when you start opening up your apps on your phone and stuff like that, there are menus in similar locations. And they're there because everybody wants to go to that same spot. So that's where we're keeping things in a similar spot. Now we get in and we start writing an interactive brief. We've talked about design briefs. We worked with design briefs in the past. We go in and start to write an interactive brief. There's a lot of similarities in here. So we want the context of the interactives to actually be within the story of the exhibition. So as we start to deal with those interactions, those interactives, where do they fit inside the overall story, that overall narrative of the exhibition? What are going to be the key content messages? So what is it that you're ultimately going to go in there and be stating with this? Key learning outcomes. So once the user goes through and works through that experience, what is that visitor going to take with them? What are they taking away from actually going in there and interacting with the interactive that you've placed inside of there? What are the details of the assets available? So we go through and we start to think about these assets. What is it that are available to you? So what do we have for objects? What do we have for reference images? What kind of data do we have available to us? If we're dealing with things that are film or video, what type of film and video is available to us? Now we can get that from a lot of places, whether we're sourcing it from stock images or whether we actually have part of our budget to go out and film individual areas. What is our audience profile? So who is the intended audience? It's going to be defined inside of that brief. What are the initial specifications for the audiovisual software? So we go through and we start to think about that. What are the things that we're most likely going to be using? As we go through and look at that, we're looking at the limitations of it. We're also looking at the strengths of it, so we can go ahead and exploit what those strengths are. Another thing that we always talk about on anything is budget. How much money do we have available to us to go through and work with that? And the challenge that we have as we go in and begin to work with that is there's a lot of those things that go into building them that we don't necessarily have the knowledge of. And that's where we get into the other considerations. So ultimately, how is the content for the interactive going to be developed? Who's in charge of that? Who's the curator that's going to go ahead and pull this up? Is the person in the space going to pull stuff? Do you have somebody else then that's set up for content development? So they're going to go in and actually create what is there. Do we have an interactive designer then that's going to take content that other people are pulling and placing it into the system to create what it is that we're going to be working with? How ultimately is the interactive going to be written? So we go through, we start talking about our copywriter, the person who goes in there and puts the great words, the wordsmiths on there. It's essential that people understand what is there. What do they have to do? How do you communicate what they have to do? Knowing that we have a limited amount of space to put that text inside of there, we need to make sure that it is direct and it is concise. That goes into those instructions and prompts. So as we tell people what they need to do, what is it that we need to tell them as they do something? What prompts also have to come up to that? We get into expense versus value. Now, interactives can be expensive, I mean, without a doubt. And we're not talking about just the ultra high tech versus mechanical. There are mechanical interactives, budget-wise, that will blow the ultra high tech ones out of the water. And it's just because we start dealing with materials, what has to happen with them, what's being integrated inside of them, that the mechanicals can get super expensive as well. The other key is that what is the function as we go into it, we start telling that story. As we tell that story, how are we ultimately going about addressing the audience itself so that we know that what we're doing with the interactive is going to lead into those parts. We start talking about that's the wrong way. The future proofing and upkeep. So as we go through and start to build that, what can we do to ensure the lifetime of the interactives? We start thinking about upgrading of software and hardware. What do we do for that? Sound. Where are we getting the sounds from? As we start working with the sound, it's important that we work with sound and think about sound from the very beginning. It's a highly effective component, but what ends up happening is that too often we start getting into an exhibition design is that it becomes almost a secondary type of setup. Sound needs to be integral. We need to think about that and really put that in there and start to think about that, work with that, change that. And the big thing with it, the hardest thing if we're not dealing with headphones, is how do we keep the sound localized so that it doesn't bleed away from the space in which we want this sound to be at. And ultimately what ends up happening then it gets into areas and muffles up those other spaces. And then lastly, when we get into here, we start looking at the standpoint of the other consideration is use the professionals. If you have the budget that allows you to hire the people that do that stuff, use them. It cannot be understated when we start talking about the fact that if you get to somebody who knows how to use something and works with something on a regular basis, the amount of time it's going to take them to do it, sometimes you'll save money by hiring somebody else than it will be to try to do it on the inside. And then the other thing by using professionals is that they have the experiences with it. Until you spend years doing exhibition design, start thinking about spaces and what you're dealing with different speakers and angles and stuff like that, it'll be great for them and it's going to actually increase that visitor experience that's there. So we go through, we start to think about what we have for our spaces. So this is going in to begin to think about what's happening with our ground plan. So what are we placing where, what's going to happen with it? So this goes through and starts to talk about all the different interactive things that are going to be inside of there. So what is it that they're going to do with them? Look at the spaces, start to think about how you're going to move from location to location. Where's sound going to be at? And then we start to look at that. So there we have this giant column there. So we see down the bottom middle, we see the smart fabric. Well, that's what we're seeing right here. Another area then we also have then is, this is the shark. So when we look at the shark skin fabric, down there in the lower right, that's going to go in and begin to play off of what we see here. We start looking at some of the other spaces. So this is going in here and seeding the future. So we go through and start to look at what exactly can we place in there. How are people going to be interacting with this? So the Seed in the Future, it's an interactive show, and it's going in there to show the height of the interactive table, and we also see the surface that's set up for the user. So what you're going to see in here is you notice that they're focusing in on not only an individual that can stand, but also somebody who's inside of a wheelchair. So we have to start to think about how are the different people going to interact with those different elements. And this is a little sketch on the left showing then where the things are going to be at on the table there. And then when we look over to the right of it, then we can see somebody in a space interacting with that. Notice they're using their hand in the air to interact and flip those pages. And then we go in and we start to look at this last one. In this case, we're starting to go in and look at what happens. We go through and we start looking at improvements in man-made structures and how they actually work off of the study of natural phenomena. So we see up at the top, we start looking at architecture. So we go through there and we start to swing that and what's going to happen with it as it moves. The second one there starts to deal with the person down at the bottom. You see they're targeting that thing. Well, it's going off of echolocation. So like bats would actually go through and communicate as to where objects are at when they're in flight. And then lastly, when we get down there to the bottom one, that's the shark skin fabric. That's explaining the fabrics that are used for swimwear to increase speed. So what are they using based upon that? So if we go through, we start to look at these. If we jump back to here, that's when we can go through and we can start to look at what's going on with the different things. So we can see the seating for the futures up there. We have our seeing with sound. We start to see the shark skin fabric. There's one other deals with tidal energy. So as we start to raising and lowering tide, what's going to happen with it. So we start to think about what's going into these. How are they all going to be similar, but yet be different? And if we look at the last one in here, you'll see then, much like we had with this, we start to deal with the stands. We see the sketches as to what the seating of the future looked like. So with that, when we go through and start to think about, that's what they look like as their main areas. And then as we go through each one, we see then how there's the slight changes to it to indicate what is happening inside of the space. Now, as I said, with this, you're going to be creating an actual digital interactive versus doing a mechanical interactive. But also in your mind, still be thinking, though, about the standpoint of what else could I do to create some interactives that aren't going to all be digital in nature. So we get into our do's. Do make sure you work with the client to get detailed feedback and agreement on the brief. So as you're working with it, work with them, work with them, work with them. You want that agreement. Remember, the brief kind of becomes your little guide sheet and also becomes your contract with them. When you go in, work with the client to get the best assets available to you and include those inside of there. And then obviously you'll take those same assets and you'll move them into the interactive when you make it. Do everything you can to make sure that as you go through and you build that interactive, that it's fun, that it's easy, and that it's full of nice, rich, new ideas and interventions that are possible. And then we also still want to maintain that simplicity and focus on accessibility. So that's the height of things, that's touch, that's whether or not we're dealing with possible screen readers and things along those lines that may need to be incorporated. Don't overcomplicate it. Remember, simple interactivity is more successful. Not only is it more successful, it's also going to be more memorable. The other thing we don't want to do, don't try to force everything possible onto your visitor. Because what's going to happen is if you overload the visitor with information, they're going to shut down, just like anything else. They're going to shut down, the experience is going to be bad. They're going to go in and say, yeah, I didn't really like that. There was so much stuff thrown at me, I didn't have a clue what was going on. So we don't want to do that. We don't also want to underestimate the good interaction and what it's going to cost to get to that good interaction. So we go through and start to think about it. Be aware it's going to cost you something. That budget comes into play, so we have to balance those things out. And then also, once you go through and you agree on what's going to be done, the interactive brief is agreed upon between you and the client, don't change anything. Unless, of course, it is 100% absolutely necessary. And when that is absolutely necessary, then what you need to do is you need to go back to your client, you need to rewrite the brief, and you need to get approval on that. Last thing you want to do is to go through and have one, work with one, get done with it, and then all of a sudden not get paid for it because you changed it without having permission to do so. So there's a lot of ways we can go with interactives. There's a lot of, again, ultra high tech, low tech, no tech. Everywhere in between there. So as you start to think about interactives in the future, don't think just digital. Think about what else you can do with them as well.